We've been focusing on applying research concepts to understand the findings of other studies. The learning goals for this class also include being able to apply knowledge of those concepts to design a study. Those two goals, understanding other studies and designing a study, come together in the research proposal. The introduction section is the first major section of a research report or proposal, and as the label suggests, it introduces the reader to the variables. Sometimes this section is also called the Lit Review because it also includes information from previous work in the area. In other words, a review of the work in the area. An APA-style introduction section is based on knowledge from other sources. The majority of the sentences typically have a citation, and the other sentences are related to the cited sentences in some way. APA style does not use statements of fact that are not supported by a citation, nor do they use opinions. It also avoids extensive quotations in favor of paraphrasing and logical extensions, which means that we aren't entirely limited by the exact variables and findings. We just need to make sure not to get too far away from the supporting evidence. Understanding the content and organization of the introduction section is a little easier when we know a couple of things about the research report as a whole, even though we won't be writing a complete research report for this class. More specifically, in APA style, we talk about the structure of the report as being like an hourglass that starts wide, narrows at the center, and then widens again at the bottom. That means the introduction section is one of the broader parts of the report, but it becomes more focused, more narrow as it progresses, so that it makes a natural transition to the most specific part of the report, the method for the particular study. Then, the results become a little more broad again as we move from the descriptive statistics based on the sample to the inferential statistics that draw conclusions about the population. The discussion continues to broaden by considering how the findings relate to other work and other implications. We'll practice the results and discussion sections later in the semester. Right now, we're focusing on applying research concepts to understand the findings of other studies and to design a study. In other words, we're focusing on the introduction section and the method section, which are the two main parts of a research proposal. The introduction section doesn't have specific subsections like the method does, but we can think of it as including three parts: a broad introduction of the variables, including why they're of interest for researchers and readers, a review of what we know from previous work, and a summary of that work that leads the reader to the hypothesis. So, when we write an APA-style introduction section, we begin with a more general introduction to the topic and why it's important. Sometimes that's a few paragraphs, but we're going to practice by writing one paragraph. Then the section talks about more specific findings, a review of the literature. That portion can be several paragraphs or even pages, but we're only going to write 2 paragraphs, maybe 3 if your organization flows better that way. Then the section finishes with a section that leads the reader to the hypothesis. You'll do the same thing in 1 paragraph at the end. At this point, you might be wondering how we can write about the findings in a way that fits with the different parts of the introduction section, let alone in a way that leads to a hypothesis. It might help if we think a little bit more about paraphrasing. Remember that paraphrasing is expressing the findings in our own words and context or form. The reference to context and form means we can write about the findings from a number of perspectives, as long as we don't generalize so much it's no longer accurate to support the statement with a citation for a particular study. I'll use the findings from the Rizzolo article as an example. The study in that article was an experiment where participants each spent 30 minutes doing yoga, watching funny videos, or reading. The researchers administered a self-report measure of stress after each activity and took physiological measures commonly associated with stress. They found that all 3 activities reduced each indicator of stress, and no one activity reduced stress more than the others. The top version in this slide might be more like you think of as a paraphrase, but the bottom version also summarizes the findings. The level of specificity in the top version would be good in the literature review section of a paper talking about specific ways to reduce stress. The bottom 2 examples are supported by the findings, even though they don't directly refer to the three types of interventions or the specific measures. The middle sentence about different activities could go into an opening paragraph to introduce the topic of stress reduction. The third sentence could be the beginning of a paragraph talking about different social activities that have been found to help reduce stress. As I mentioned earlier, the paraphrased sentences are organized in a way that leads to the hypothesis. It's sort of like you're telling a story of what we know, with the supporting citations indicating you're not making things up, and then ending with what you think will happen next. It might be a little backward from how you're used to writing papers. In some types of writing, the author presents a hypothesis or an argument, and the purpose of the paper is to explain the support for that hypothesis or argument. In APA style, the introduction section explains the logic for the prediction, and then the method section explains how the prediction will be tested. The results in discussion explain whether it was supported. One way to think about it is that the hypothesis is the destination for the introduction section, not the starting point. The rest of the introduction section leads the reader to the hypothesis. As the author, you establish the direction and the route so you can lead your reader through the ideas in a way that makes the hypothesis part of a logical path. A blog post titled Literature Review Tips 5 Steps to an Outstanding Paper says the first step is to focus on structure, then content, then style. In my experience, and with the steps I'm guiding you through, it's not quite that sequential. We go back and forth with structure and content as we think about what we know, the different ways things relate to one another, and the broad to narrow structure. The one thing I agree with entirely, though, is that it's much easier to think about writing style separately after you figure out content and structure. There are a few reasons I suggest that and structure the process to encourage that. One is because it can be overwhelming to think about it all at once. The other is because separating content from style helps maintain accuracy. So, the next step in the process I have you use for this class is to create a rough outline, or a list of the information that will be in each paragraph and the order it will be in. There are several ways to work with the information to create that outline, but they all start with paraphrased sentences about the findings from the articles that you'll cite and reference. You might be able to use the exact sentences from the previous assignment, or versions that are revised based on my feedback from that assignment. You can also revise sentences if you find they fit better as a more general idea in the first paragraph. You could take those sentences and put them on Post-it notes in different orders. You could use one of the tools in Microsoft Word or PowerPoint to create a chart. You could create a concept map. There might be another strategy you're familiar with that's more helpful. Just to remember, the goal is to list the paraphrased statements in the order that makes sense for the structure and the flow, not to write paragraphs.